our next speaker is Art Thomas, Professor Art Thomas from Syracuse University. Art's the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Syracuse. His school's a leading center for innovative programs in information policy, information management, information systems and technology, et cetera, and Art is not only, a faculty member, but he's also been a professional consultant and trainer, has held corporate management roles, including Chief Learning Officer, Chief Information Officer roles. He has lots of interesting stuff to say about managing complex projects, so I'm expecting that we'll all learn from this, including me. And one of the great things about being a professor and doing this stuff is that we're always learning, It doesn't stop when you get your PhD and you start to teach. We're constantly learning just the same as everybody else. So I love these events as much as you do. So, without further ado, Art, you're on.
Thank you so much, and welcome to the session. And it's an honor to be able to speak with you today about complex projects. The interesting thing about projects is that all projects are complex. It's just some are more complex than others, or at least some of us think that our projects are more complex than the other person's project is. So whenever I got into this whole concept of complex projects, I began to wonder, well, what exactly is the definition? And it was interesting because the definitions for complex projects are very complex. So we'll see about this. But anyway, bear with me here, work with me, and we'll see if we can figure this out. But I just want to describe for you in terms of the kinds of things that I think about in terms of the complexity of projects and what this particular presentation will hopefully help you understand. And a lot of this has to do with what it is in the field that people are thinking about and some of the things that are most important for you to think about in your own context. And that's what I'd like to be able to help you with today, is just thinking about this in your own context. In terms of this particular graphic, this is the concept of a complex project, all right? And so you end up with being able to say, well, if you had your choice, what do you focus on in this graphic? And everybody's going to focus on some particular thing and say, yeah, that's it, yep. Okay, so you've got the unstable. It's like, oh yeah, unstable, right, yeah, that's it, right? And then there's the other one that says interconnected. Geez, yeah, absolutely, interconnected. And then there's the dynamic or the nonlinear, right? And everybody is going to relate to some particular term in there. And you're going to say, wow, I must have had a complex project then. And the idea is, yeah, you probably did, because a lot of your projects qualify as complex because they have these traits. And as a result of that, we are all confronted by the concept of complexity. And that's really what ends up defining our life today. As project managers, we're becoming into a scenario where things are just simply increasing by the moment in terms of complexity. And as a matter of fact, the concept of complexity is something that is very truthfully becoming worse. All right, it's becoming more complex. So it's complexity squared when you think about it. And the idea behind this is that it's not going away, it is only getting worse. An IBM study particularly said that 4 out of 5 CEOs were saying that complexity is the concept that will increase, and that they didn't trust their people in the company to handle it. That's what's really sad. When you think about the concept of complexity, it's like all around us, and yet the CEOs of the companies are basically saying, yeah, well, I doubt that we can handle this properly. Woof. That's rather depressing when you think about it. So here we are as project managers, and we can handle it, right? Work with me here, right? Yeah, whoa, okay, so none of this nonsense. So the idea is that the complexity has to be something that we do and that we just take in stride. And that's really what the concept has to be for us. The Pulse of the Profession report came out with this particular concept of what it is that people felt about project complexity. And this was published in September of 2013. It's PMI's report on navigating complexity. And so there are a couple of highlights in this, but you can see some of the priorities that people said make a project complex. So these were the things that people said, if it weren't for this stuff, it'd be simple. But because of this stuff, it's complex. And there are a few overriding concepts. And the first is multiple stakeholders. The idea behind this was the most important thing defining complexity. If you only had one stakeholder, it'd not be a problem, right? And the problem with projects is that usually you don't just have one stakeholder. You've got a whole bunch of people. And the more people you have who are stakeholders or stakeholder groups, the more diversity they bring in terms of their expectations. And they're all expecting you, the adept and incredible project manager, to work this all out. And they don't worry about what other stakeholders there are, because every stakeholder figures that you're going to worry about that. So all they need to tell you is what they're concerned about. Okay, so in the end, it's like, well, I just want you to know that this is my thing, and I need you to be able to do that this way. And you're like, okay, fine. And everybody is telling you that, and so the end result is that you're in the midst of this nonsense of everybody wanting something different. And you've got to figure out how to bring this project to completion while everybody has their own goals in stock. So multiple stakeholders is one of the most defining characteristics, and to the degree that they are, in fact, different, then that means that you have much more balancing to do. And that's really what makes project management a complex thing in certain projects. This was the next most important concept of complexity, ambiguity, which means we haven't got a clue. All right? So that's, ambiguity sounds very cool. It's like, yes, well, this project has a lot of ambiguity, which means I don't have a clue what we're doing here, but that's good. We're going to go forward and handle this. We're going to get this done. And part of ambiguity has to do with the fact that you've got so many stakeholders who are, diverse in their concepts, and they don't know themselves what it is that they want. Part of what we do as projects is to help people learn what it is that they want. There's this whole thing about the learning organization, the scope creep, the whole concept of being able to develop your ideas as you go along. And yet, that's what makes things complex, because we'd like to have, well, just build this thing. Okay, we can do that, but when you don't know what the thing is, that makes it hard. And when several people don't know what their things are, well, that makes it even harder. So you'd like to get the group together in one room, slap them upside the head and say, come on, people, what do you want? Right? But that's a hard thing to do. So this managing complexity has to do with the fact that people often don't know. And they're looking for ways to figure out what it is that they're supposed to get out of the project. The next most important trait is political authority and various influencers of all kinds. You've met them. They are your sponsors, your stakeholders. They are surrounding you, right? And we live in a world of influence. So you become suspicious of the people who take you to lunch, right? And so that concept has to be, uh-oh, what do they want from me, right? And that's the problem. And also, you're under pressure. There's a lot of different kinds of things that cause you to be under pressure with some sort of influence because of the fact that you don't want to screw up. And if you screw up in a complex project, there's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of people who end up seeing that. So that ends up building pressure. And you're at the point where you're saying, I can't afford to screw up. Well, you can't afford to screw up anyway as a project manager, but you can't afford at all to screw up if you're in a complex, very visible kind of a project. So there's all kinds of agendas going on in the project, and that defines that the project is somewhat more complex than we'd like to think. And finally, the next most important thing about a complex project is the fact that technologies are not perfected or not understood. And the sponsor who basically said they came to one of these conferences, on some particular technology, and they came back and they said, I want one of those. Right? And so you're like, well, why do you want one of those? Well, it's cool, and we should have one. So we need one. So build me one of those. Right? You know the people. You've been there. All right. And so you're just saying to yourself, well, what are we going to get out of this? Does anybody know anything about this? And of course, the sponsor's trusting you. You're the project manager. You can build all these things. You can do all these magical things. And so you can figure this out. All right. And you're saying, well, but, and of course you don't want them to know that you don't know anything about this, right? Because you're the project manager. So you're like, yeah, right, sure, I'll handle it. No problem. And then you have to figure out, who do I get around the table? What do I do? How do I make sure that I understand what this technology is? And we all know that particularly the concept of technology is something that can derail a project and get us into trouble, massive trouble. So these are the most important things that came out of that study. And those are the things that we've all experienced. And we can all say, well, therefore, we're heading down a path here of certain destruction unless we figure out what it is that we're supposed to do about complex projects. And so this concept of complexity is something that's being studied. And I would encourage you to go out and search for the different things about project complexity, because this is getting to be a thing now. Okay, there are things in our business, and this is one of them now. And the idea behind this is that there are research studies, there's different kinds of trade journal articles. In fact, the most recent PM Network from PMI focused on an article on complexity. And part of what we have to figure out is there a thing we do about complex projects that's different from everything else? And if so, what is it, so that we can make that happen better? And that's really what we need to talk about. So this set of key issues in complexity was developed by the International Center for Complex Project Management. Did you know that there was one? Wouldn't it be interesting how complex that project management is for coming up with a study like this in the International Center for Complex Project Management? But I guess, so I wonder what the qualifications are for belonging, I'm just a simple guy. I'm sorry, you don't qualify. So anyway, the idea behind this is that they're taking a look at these sorts of things, and look at the date, 2009. Long time ago, people were starting to think about this, and we're coming up with the concepts of what causes things to be complex and what causes things to go wrong and make it such that you have to really scramble to figure out what to do. So this concept of complexity has been around, and we just need to start dealing with it because we're going to be surrounded. It's kind of engulfing us as we speak. So we end up with a series of components that I put together just because of putting together all kinds of different resources. These are the things that really seem to matter. And you end up with, obviously, the stakeholder concept. You've got the whole idea of complexity, but you still have to get something of quality at the end. You have to have some understanding of what political pressures you are under and what it is that you're going to do about that. Everything is uncertain. You have no idea what the next day is going to bring, and so you have to prepare yourself. The idea of risk in a complex project focuses on regular risks, yes, but it's the non-technical risks that can bring you down. And the idea of non-technical risks is something that's very special about this particular class of project. Procurement and contracts, very different as you go into larger and larger projects, and as a result, that in and itself brings complexity to the overall process. You have to integrate all kinds of different thinking and different kinds of disciplines. You're in a situation where the regulations of all the different governments and different kinds of compliance requirements are such that it causes you to have to think about multiple dimensions that you didn't realize were there till somebody tells you, by the way, there's a rule against that. And you're like, okay, tell me about that. Estimates are most important in projects like this, but because of the complexity, they are more difficult to arrive at. And so even the estimation concept is something that can get you into trouble. You know that thing in the water cooler conversation that you have with your sponsor, where they take you out in the hallway and they're like, so, Art, that project we were talking about. Yeah, right. So how much is that going to cost? I mean, I won't hold you to anything. It's, just give me a ball. I know you haven't planned it yet, but just give me a ballpark. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't really have that. No, I'm not, I know you're in the development of it. That's okay. But, is it like 1 million, 2 million? What is it? Well, certainly won't go over 2. All right. And then, of course, you know what happens. Murphy's Law. You turn in the estimate that's $2,030,375. And what does that person say? You said it wasn't going to go over 2 million. You promised. Right? So that's the point. The estimates on these projects can get you into trouble. And the idea behind estimates is that you have to be even more concerned because of all the diverse stakeholders and processes that you're going through. This is a change management concept as well, because complex projects result in complex changes. You have to have a degree of communication going on in the project that draws all this stuff together, and of course the whole concept of who's running the show and what it is that you have to do about making sure that all the parts are working together. So I just want to explore these areas with you, and we're just going to take a few of them and go through some general concepts. But the first, of course, has to be this idea of stakeholder complexity, because that's where we lead off in any kind of most important aspects of this. And the whole concept of stakeholder complexity has to do with communication. Now, we were talking about that yesterday, and we'll be talking about that this afternoon a lot, in the idea of project communication being so important to make sure that all the pieces get together and all the components work the way they're supposed to in the project, and all the people understand what it is their expectations are all about. So this concept of multiple perspectives is really a matter of communication. It's communication toward those people that are trying to elicit the right information, but it's also making sure that this stuff evolves along with the project. And communication is most important in that. The downside of communication is negativity, and the whole idea of self-interests interfering with the communication to start with. If you get the wrong communication rolling, you'll become a negative force, all right? And it will bring the entire project down. On the other hand, if you can turn that around and be a positive communication force, well, then everybody will knit together and become a team, and it'll be a rousing success in the end, which is what we all envision for stuff like this. But the idea is that communication still is the most important thing that you can do. And as a result, this whole thing about communication being important in project management, it is even more important the more complex your project is. We go to risk. And risk management is something that we know about. We know how to plan for uncertainty and that sort of thing. But the worst thing about complex projects is this nature of non-technical risks. Because the non-technical risks are something we say, yeah, okay, we'll worry about that. But in a complex project, we have to worry about it first. It's the first thing we should be planning for. The idea of what is it that's non-technical here that could go wrong? All right, and that is that somebody could come in with a totally different agenda. We could have a stakeholder group just suddenly appear. And you know, public projects are like that, right? Everybody goes through and designs everything, and then by the time they make the announcement from the legislature, all of a sudden 18 stakeholder groups come up. And you're like, where did they come from? They came out of the woodwork, right? And then they're protesting because their interests aren't being purposely built into the plan. So the concept of non-technical risk is an issue. And you can see here that you have political types of non-technical risks. What happens if you get changes in politics in the organization? What happens if people adopt different sources of power and so forth? Where are the power brokers? You have these external stakeholder groups that you have to watch out for or even plan for in cases where your project is becoming something that affects those external groups. And of course, when you're planning multiple dimensions of things, things can go wrong. So the planning itself may not take account of something. And with that, you've got issues just in terms of how to take account of the planning going wrong. And then just when you think you've got everything under control, the government announces one more regulation that totally screws everything up, and you got to start over from scratch, right? As if you don't need that. So the non-technical risk elements are something that will bring a project down, and you've got to take into account what you're going to do about that without even realizing what they are. But hey, we can do this. We're project managers, right? Okay, work with me here, right? Yeah, okay, all right, good. Don't lose hope, all right? Come along with me, you're okay, all right. So the whole idea is that, well, we're used to planning for things that we don't know about. We teach that in classes, you know, we preach that around the organizations. It's like, yeah, well, we can plan for uncertainty. You just got to do it more intensely. You got to think more broadly about what the uncertainties might be. And that sort of thing is where your planning for complexity is going to make sense. All right, and it's going to really pay off. If you plan on the non-technical side as well, all right, which means, yes, you still have to plan for the technical risks. That's easy compared to the non-technical ones. And so that sort of a process is saying, get people around the table and say, don't talk to me about whether this system is going to work or whether the bridge is going to fall. Tell me whether or not something's going to surprise me. All right, and where is the surprise going to come from? Where is it likely to come out? All right, and part of what happens in a complex project is when you delegate responsibilities of specialties and you say, well, you're the expert in this, so you take care of that, and you're the expert in that, so you take care of that. The issue about risk planning and risk management gets siloed away. You can't afford that in a complex project. The complexity of the project means it's got to be coordinated centrally. So you have to break down those barriers. Risk management in silos is no longer acceptable. Okay? It's not an expertise thing, it's a coordination thing. And overall, any one of these risks can bring the project down. Okay, it'll get better. It's all right. Work with me here, okay? All right. We go on to the concept of the project management office. We do that in organizations to try and bring consistency and standards and all of that sort of thing. And so the benefits of a PMO are well known. We've identified that, and we're, working along the lines of being able to explore these whenever it becomes appropriate. So the idea behind this is that, okay, we know what the benefits are of a project management office. The issue is, how do we make this work in a complex project? And here's where the PMO really can become that centralized place. But it isn't that the PMO runs it, it's the fact that it serves as the place for being where all of this information is coordinated. And maybe in your organization that can run it properly, but the point is there's different roles it can play, and each one of them can help with a complex project. And so you have the idea of this functional PMO that basically says that, well, based upon a particular function in the organization, this is the sales project PMO, and this is the IT PMO, okay? That's fine. But of course, in a complex project, these have to work together. So maybe that's got to be bridged in some way, even if you have that structure. If you have a customer group PMO saying, well, these are the college students from whatever, marketplace, that's their project group, and here we have consumer products over here, and we have wholesale products over there. Well, so you might have PMOs that are like that, but again, it may be that unknown to you, the uncertainty of stakeholder groups popping up and causing issues may mean that you need to get across those customer groups and not let them be just isolated. The corporate or strategic PMO is the one that's at the top. The biggest issue with this one is that it may be too generalized. It may be more strategic than it should be for a complex project management. And so you may have to interject more of a sense of reality to that particular kind of PMO. The point is, the way things are helps you to determine what you need to do about it, but the point is also that you must do something about it. Okay? You can't let this work on its own. You can't just say, yeah, well, we have a PMO, it's okay. No, maybe not. Okay? You have to be able to figure out, is that really the way it should be? We have pressures that develop all over the place in these kinds of scenarios, and they're pressures that surprise us. We have pressures that come from individuals, and here are some examples of this. You know the person who always comes in saying, yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, oh yeah, not an issue. What about these issues? No, we can handle that. That's no problem at all. How soon can we get this done? Faster than you can imagine, right? Of course, this is cool. And so that optimism bias is what we call, where the person is just, you can't say anything that will bring them down. You can't say, well, what if an atomic bomb hit? Well, we'd figure out a way to hide and do this underground. That's no problem. We still reach the end date, right? So the point is that you got to watch people who will come in with that attitude. Okay, it's okay to be optimistic, but if they are continually optimistic to the point of ignoring what it could be, then you have to take some action. You have to say, okay, I need somebody with a dose of reality here. The person who is planning incorrectly may, in fact, lead you astray. So that's where you're getting bad data, or you're getting a plan that wasn't thought through. So just because you have a plan doesn't mean it's going to be the right one, and you need to vet these things. That's really what's going on here. The anchoring effect. Well, we've always done it this way. We've done it this far, or we've done this much. So let's just keep going. And those are the things that that cause you to take an action that may in fact not be correct, because people aren't willing to break free of that anchor and say, well, okay, maybe we should think of this differently. Even the way things are framed, the way they're portrayed in the sense of the actual concept of what you're doing, may eliminate from the frame essential pieces of the complex project that you're getting into. You know, the concept of, well, I think I'm going to buy this old house and I'm going to renovate the kitchen. And you know how that goes, right? You renovate the kitchen, and then that wall between the kitchen and the dining room didn't work, and so you got to renovate the dining room. And then that, of course, meant that you discovered that the floor in the bedroom upstairs in the dining room wasn't working, and so you might as well replace that. And then pretty soon you've renovated the entire interior because of the fact that you framed it as a kitchen project, and you ignored the fact that the whole house was in a problem. All right, so this framing effect affects us as project managers too, and we have to watch that. The sunk cost effect causes us an issue. Well, I came into a project at one point that they had spent $7 million and worked 7 years. And I said, so what have you got to show for it? And they said, well, we have a spreadsheet that says that we spent $7 million and we've been working 7 years. And I said, so what do you want to get done? Well, we've been working on this for 7 years, and we're not exactly sure what we need to get done, but we've got a lot of thinking that's gone into this, you know. And they were desperate. They basically said, help us out here, because we've sunk all this money in. And you would think, well, why didn't you stop it back in the earlier points, right? But no, they kept going. So at that stage, I said, okay, either the project stops or we finish it properly. But I'm not going to let it go another year and another million. Okay, but you've got to be able to establish, well, what is the sunk cost effect for this? Are we just going to keep going, or is it something that we can break free? And then, of course, there's the misrepresentation. And that's just simply where a person leads you astray and says, yeah, we can do this, or this is happening, or this is a feature, or this is something that'll definitely take place, and it really isn't going to happen. And that's a danger. And so you've just got to figure out, well, if that happens, then how are you going to handle that? On the group level side, teams can be an issue on these kinds of pressures as well. The tribal mindset, you know, oh yeah, we'll show them, all right? They can't invade our village, right? We're going to show them, we're going to prove that we can make this work, whether or not it's sensible. The whole idea of groupthink. Well, we all get together and we all say, you know, we ought to be doing this, and somebody takes the lead, and then everybody is afraid to violate the group. And so that causes the pressure. And on a complex project, you've got a lot of these different stakeholder groups that can infiltrate the overall team mindset. We talk about the blessings of being able to have a group that takes its own course and, you know, organizes itself and goes forward. And of course, that's your worst nightmare in a complex project, because when they organize themselves and go forward on their own course, you're like, whoa, 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 wait a minute, come back here. That's not where we want to go. And so that concept of this self-autonomous group is maybe not a good idea, as long as you can keep control of it, but you have to be able to infiltrate a little bit more of this idea of what it is they should be doing to make sure that they stay within the rails. The legal perspectives will pop up from all over the place, and as a result, you're going to get people saying that, well, this is the appropriate thing to do, or this is the appropriate thing to do, or there's this regulation, or, well, we can get around this regulation this way. And as a result of that, you're constantly battling this idea about, well, what do we do in order to be able to get this done when there's so many different kinds of rules and regulations that are upon us? And nobody seems to have a clear idea of how we should handle any one of them. Our cultures vary, and so just the world view of who we are and how we figure out what success is and what our expectations are can affect us. And, of course, the fact that this project was never suited for the organization to start with, but we're doing it anyway. That misalignment of strategy that we're all very familiar with in project management. Well, simple techniques go a long way, and I had the opportunity to work with a very complex project that involved a lot of moving parts, And those of you from academia will know that any kind of project involving academic people is like herding cats. This is the famous phrase that we all use about that, because cats just will not be herded. Okay, so that's just not the way they are. And as a result of this concept, it was a challenge. And this was a corporate, government, and academic triumvirate that we were trying to get together. And so, yeah, that was a complex project. And the concept behind this was, how do I manage all of these people in a way that can be helpful and yet at the same time get things done? And in the result of that, what I found was some very simple techniques. I used a spreadsheet for a tracking tool. I used a communication plan to figure out how things should work, and I got everybody to agree. Simple things that we already know. And in fact, I got rid of some of the more complex tools. Because just because the project was big, and just because the project had a lot of players, didn't mean I had to use a complex tool to manage it. Some of the more simple tools are the things that make the more clarification that you need in bringing people together and communicating what really needs to go on. And so don't be afraid to use something simple. That's the important concept behind this. And if you don't use something simple, you are opening yourself up to the very complexity of the technology of the tool, that you're actually using, and you're introducing that also into the project. So now you have to ask yourself, is managing the tool really as important as the results of that tool? All right? So think about the concept that in a project like this, where we had so many different kinds of moving parts and so many stakeholders that were involved, how could I just manage it with a spreadsheet, a contract, and a communication plan? Well, everybody agreed that's what we did. And as a result, everybody was operating under the same consistent approach. So it worked. And we actually got this done. So if you want to go at some point to fairhealth.org, you'll be able to get medical costs for any particular procedure, medical procedure anywhere in the United States of America in any zip code, and it will tell you what that should cost. And then when you go to your doctor and say, it's going to cost me what? Do you know that it should actually cost this? Well, at least you'll have something to go on. And that was the whole nature of this project. So we got it done. And you can do that now, any zip code in the US. So it's possible to manage things with simple tools. And I want you to think about that. In the end, we're talking about project management as change, and we all know that. We all know that we're change agents. We have targets on our back because we're trying to bring stuff into organizations that people don't want. We're familiar with that. We got into this business with our eyes open, and we know that that's what our lot is. But part of what has happened over the last few years is this concept of technology becoming disruptive. I remember, by the way, as a young person, when I was disciplined for being disruptive. You're being too disruptive, right? And now it's like, wow, this is disruptive. That's cool. Right? Yeah? And you have workshops like this where people say, be disruptive. Don't go along with the group. Just be disruptive. It's like, okay, how do I rationalize this upbringing, all right? But the idea is that the technology of disruption is that it brings unexpected results at unexpected times from unexpected places. And as a result of that, we are dealing with something that is uncertain. And because of that uncertainty, if we're trying to manage a complex project, which is in and of itself uncertain, and we're dealing with a disruptive technology, which is in and of itself disruptive and uncertain, then how are we going to manage that? And that's a good question. You expected I was going to answer that, right? But this best practice concept up here is really what's important. You have to say to yourself, well, if it's new to us, maybe we ought to just experiment with this for a minute and get our feet wet and not give up on the old technologies until we are quite certain of what we're doing, and then monitor this up the gazoo, as we would say, and be able to make sure that we're tracking the results, we're tracking the concept of what this technology is giving us, and that the project itself has either achieved its results or not. So you don't jump in wholeheartedly into a disruptive technology any more than anything else. And that's where if your CEO comes back and says, I want one of those because Corporation X has one, you say, yep, well, we'll experiment with that and let you know how that's going to work out. Okay? Because that's the only way you can bring it into a successful conclusion. The risk on these things is extremely high, and so you want to be able to make sure that you can vet that risk as carefully as you can with the experimentation. We have different degrees of change, and we all know that change takes different forms in different kinds of ways. And so this type of change management is such that we have to take actions that are different on the basis of what it is we're changing. So the concept of types of change is really what this particular part is telling you about. And the idea is that you have more to do in third order and second order change than you do in first order. And so as a result, you've got to plan for it. I know that the most successful project management organizations plan for change management. That's one of their things. They start right out saying, well, we're going to be changing this, so how do we handle it? And who's going to be affected by it? And who are the stakeholders? And who are the uncertain things? And where are we actually going to find the things that are going to go wrong? And how are we going to manage that during this transition? Cross impact. If we change this, what's going to happen with that over there? And what are we going to do about that? And preparing people to handle the change when it finally comes down. And so we're talking about that even with first order change. Let alone you get into this concept of second and third order. And what are most organizations heading for? What are the most organizations saying to themselves they need to do? Third order change. Everybody's heading for that. Everybody says we got to have that. That's where we need to go. We got to rethink what we're doing. Well, that is the most complex thing you can do. And so you, the project manager, have to call everybody to conscience and say, okay, but we got to plan this out. It's not just going to change all by itself. And just implementing what we're doing isn't going to change the organization. We have to figure this out properly. And we have all kinds of things in the way to change. We've talked about all this in project management, and as a result, you know that you've got all kinds of different cultural elements that block change and that stand in the way. You've got all kinds of issues in the project that could derail the project and prevent the change from coming in the way it's supposed to. So as a result, change management has to be more concentrated in a project like this. And you've got to be honest about that. You've got to say, okay, I got to concentrate on this. I can't leave it to somebody else. I can't ignore it any longer. And we have a very clear concept of what project change is all about. This is studied. This has been studied for decades. So we know what we need to do. Our biggest issue is we need to just do it. And this concept of being able to manage this is something that we have to take seriously the more complex the project is. So, yes, you have a very complex project, and there's all these moving parts, and they all work together, and you've got to bring them all together somehow. But you can do this, and it's not rocket science. Actually, there are some complex projects that are rocket science, but that's not what I'm talking about here. The idea is that every project has a dimension of complexity, and some just have more than others. And what you have to figure out is, how am I going to manage these things? I would suggest that you first start, if you have not already, by doing some research on some things that are very close to home. And these are books that are very much available, and the Pulse of the Profession report in the middle. This kind of summarizes things. Don't delve into the complexities of complexity, okay? You got to go simple into complexity, and you've got to go from the summary, start, and work your way into it. And these are going to be very helpful to you, and it's the kind of thing that you can get an idea of what complexity is all about. It's enough to make you dangerous, so that's good, all right? But at the same time, it doesn't weight you down with trying to figure this out over a multi-month period of time that you don't have. So that's really what you should be handling, all right? And so do yourself the favor of doing the research. So the best project management approaches for complexity are that first you have to have risk management practices. You've got to work on project benefits and performance measures, change management, portfolio and program management strategies, supplier and resource management, incremental and iterative methodologies that will allow for change and redirection, a project management office maybe. And you also have to have organizational agility. Does that look familiar? It's like, that looks like project management to me. Right. Exactly. It is project management. And isn't it interesting that the things that are the most effective in complex projects are what you already know how to do? And what people are saying is, yeah, that is what it is that makes the difference. People, when asked about what skills made the difference in complex project management, look at what they said. It wasn't the tool you used. It wasn't the kind of concept about how it is that you manage things in terms of all the different technologies and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't how many meetings you had. It was how you led people. Just simple leadership. Get your act together as a project leader. Lead this organization and say, yes, we can do this, but we got to think of these things. Stop ignoring these things. Listen to me. Okay? And those are the things that will make all the difference in the world. And research after research after research study has pointed this out. So you can do this. Of course you can. In the concept of the simple words, complex projects don't require anything different than what you normally do. The idea is that the best practices that you know about are the best practices you still need to do. And in fact, the whole problem is that people don't do them. And that's what leads to the failures. That's what leads to the embarrassments, all of the things about I should have or I could have or I would have. And so the point is that in research study after research study, the people who were successful at complex project management were the ones who actually did project management. All right? And so, in even simpler words, you know what to do, so just do it. Okay? Thank you.